Well, listener, it seems you're one amongst the 250 who have subscribed to my channel, who have come to listen to me ramble my scary stories that others have told me. I thank you, listeners, and for this, I'm going to unveil my new avatar, made for me by Reaper's Horror, a lovely, lovely chap from the Horror Hive. If you want to see him and his work and various other scary narrators like myself, check out the Horror Hive. I'm one of the Hive myself. So, listeners, without any further ado, let's go back in with some scary, icky insect stories. I bring you two tales of terror tonight. Sit back, relax, warm your feet by my fire, whilst I tell you these tales. My dad's a cop, and this is the craziest call he has ever been on. By Hunter C. 1310. Quick thing before we get started. I'm not a professional writer, therefore I may not have the best grammar/sentence structure, but I'll try my best. As a kid, I've always wanted to follow in my dad's footsteps and become a police officer. Hell, I dressed up as a cop for Halloween 3 years in a row as a kid. So a couple of months ago, I asked my dad what was the craziest thing he had seen as a cop, and the first answer that he gave was that he had seen a body that had been decomposing in a house for 3 weeks before being found. Safe to say I wasn't satisfied with that answer. So I pushed a little harder and restructured my question a little. I then asked him what was the craziest call he has ever been on. It took him a minute to respond, and for the next 15 minutes he told me something that will stick with me for the rest of my life. My dad worked for 2 big police departments in his career, so far, but he also worked for a smaller, local police department in a rural town. I'm not going to name the department or town in this post. He tells me that it was a normal, mundane day in the life of a cop. He worked day shift. When a call came over the radio, something about someone dialing 911 before abruptly hanging up. The person had given somewhat of a location before hanging up the phone. My dad said this wasn't an uncommon thing in the town he was in, since cell phone reception was pretty terrible there. But just to be safe, he 1040'd, drove really fast, over to the given location. He says it took him around 10 minutes to get there, and there was nothing but a lot of trees and a small cabin, although he wouldn't really call it a cabin, more like a shack with a basement. The first thing he noticed was massive scratch marks on the walls of this place, and the door looked like it was torn apart like it was a piece of cardboard. He immediately thought that this had been the work of a bear, and he called for backup before entering the cabin. Upon arrival, my dad and the other officer entered the cabin, and he tells me it was the most gruesome sight he'd ever seen. Fresh blood dripping down the wall in front of him. He knew this had to have happened very recently, because there were very few flies in the cabin. Him and Anderson, just so I don't have to say the other officer every time, continue deeper into the cabin and find some stairs to a basement. They go down, and to their surprise they find a little girl, shaking like she'd seen a ghost. He says it took the paramedics hours to get her talking again. So he goes back to his car to call for paramedics and to report his findings. He says that he was quite interested to see what the girl had to say. So on his next day off he went down to the station and managed to get a hold of the file. The girl told paramedics and detectives that she saw a spider kill her father. But she then goes on to say that it wasn't really a spider. She says that it had arms and legs like a spider, but it had a head. The file ended there, as apparently the girl was too distraught to continue. My dad told me that he quit his job there a few weeks after that, and he's never visited the town since. He then told me something that shook me even more. Remember the Anderson guy I mentioned earlier? Well, he ended up getting a little obsessed with this case, and for some unearthly reason decided that he was going to investigate the surrounding woods even further to figure out what happened in that cabin. My dad was the last person Anderson texted before his death. "Hey, I'm gonna go out and set up some trap cams at that shack, if you're down to join me." My dad must have been sleeping when Anderson sent the text, because the next few texts that were sent were from my dad. "Hey, Anderson, where you at, bud? Anderson, your wife is looking for you. Give me a call as soon as you see this. Anderson! Anderson!" Anderson's body was never found. All that was found was his cell phone and a blooded trap camera. That story alone isn't what prompted me to post here on Reddit, but I was browsing through and saw a post that seemed eerily familiar. Edit. I'm thinking about digging into this a little more. I mean, not too much. Don't want to end up like Anderson. But I really want to know what could be in those woods. I'm not going to tell my dad, for obvious reasons, and I'll probably never bring up the story again, since it seems to have really scarred him. I'll report anything I find. Itsy Bitsy by Chaos Along Third. I'm writing this for my own sanity. I know no one will believe me. There was nothing left in the morning after anyway. But my manager, those police officers, they can all go to hell. I know what I saw, and it wasn't sleep deprivation or being overworked, or some coping mechanism. I started working at that hotel in the Poconos after I got out of college. I had loans to pay off, and working night shift would allow me to work on outside projects while I watched the front desk. The property was small, only the main office and then the 10 rooms we had for rent. The parking lot was ingeniously put between the main office and the rental rooms. And worse yet, the office windows did not face the hotel rooms, only the street. So any complaints I receive in the middle of the night required me to get up and cross the parking lot. The main office was small, only large enough for 1 or 2 people at the counter, and then room for me behind the desk. 10 rooms don't require much paperwork or many keys, so the office was bare of any official paperwork, save for the small file drawer under the desk. 2 waiting room chairs were stuffed into the corner in front of the desk, but no one ever wanted to sit in them. Besides appearing like they were ripped from a Greyhound bus, and awfully stained, sitting in them made you face the front desk abysmally close, with no room to move your legs. There was a single phone in the office which could make outside calls, but required a painfully long code to be input before you could dial out. There were no outlets in the front office save for a single power strip, which was haphazardly filled with every plug for anything electric. Worse yet, any customer sitting in the chairs could accidentally kick the power strip, causing the lights to flicker or go out. The row of 10 hotel rooms was a long building sitting at the back of the property. The owner figured that the ancient trees towering over the backside would provide ample shade in the summer, so the string of rooms was built beneath them. I grew up in the Poconos, and never before nor ever again do I want to see trees that old. At night they could play vicious tricks on your eyes, and appear to move when there was no breeze. The creaking of their branches would roar above the katydids. The whole place smelled of desperation, where people would go after they had committed horrible crimes, or would want to get away from their wives with some girl from the office. I've had 1 or 2 angry wives rocket into the parking lot, screaming at the top of their lungs. With so few tenants, I had never received a noise complaint even then. The only sounds that you would hear during the night were from nature, and those staying in the Poconos know that that is par for the course. But nature isn't fully understood, and if that night is any indication of its depths, then I pray we never know them. That night I had 2 guests. The first was a well-to-do businessman, who insisted I only call him by his first name. He had come from New York, he told me, and was just staying for 1 night before he caught the bus in the morning. They have his full name and information on file behind the desk. I try not to think about it. Tim was nice enough, even though he looked absolutely appalled when he arrived at the office. I tried my hardest not to laugh at the man who was probably used to 5-star stays in Miami or Florida, and he had a hard enough time bringing his briefcase up to the counter that we both had a good laugh. He was friendly, so I walked him over to his room, number 8, and gave him our rules and regulation. His only request was that I not wake him in the middle of the night, because he had to be up so early to make the bus. After Tim settled in, it must have been hours before I saw another person out on the street. It wasn't until maybe 1 AM before I saw a car drive by at breakneck speeds. No doubt some high school kid out on a joyride, his engine roaring through to your ears before you could see the car come, and well after it had gone. It was 2 AM when I saw the second guest. He walked in a kind of staggered pace, as if he had a broken or sprained leg. He wore a long trench coat with business attire underneath, and a large fedora that nearly blocked his entire face. From what I could glean, I was happy for the hat. The man looked to have been mangled in some horrible attack, and did his best to keep his head down when he stumbled into the office. Around his neck was a red scarf that wrinkled and twitched as he moved. I had not noticed when the man walked up from the street because of the lack of lighting outside, but he was actually quite wide, and at first I worried that he would not fit in the office. His back took up much of this width, looking to be some sort of large hump or deformity. I tried not to look at it, but with a man hiding his face it was hard not to notice. At times it seemed to move on its own, or make quiet squishing noises. I took the time to gag when I bent down to retrieve his check-in paperwork. When I returned from under the desk, the man was sitting in one of the waiting chairs. I was surprised to see a person of his size fit into the chair comfortably, and it almost seemed like a part of him had been swallowed by the crease to accommodate. I caught myself staring and turned quickly, hoping he did not notice me. He did not move at all. Eager to get this strange man out of the office, I asked for his papers. He struggled to get his hands into his pockets, almost as if he was using his arm for the first time. I figured it was the medications he was probably on. The motion reminded me of a puppeteer trying to work a marionette, and I felt bad for him with whatever malady afflicted his body. Eventually he succeeded, and produced his ID and credit card. The ID read Brad Geiger of Chalfont, Pennsylvania. The picture that accompanied it showed a young man smiling. I dared not ask for Mr. Geiger to look up to match the photo. Clearly whatever had happened to him had happened after the picture was taken, and to ask for something like that was of very poor taste. I smiled and slid the ID back to Mr. Geiger, who again fumbled to pick it up. I had lived in Chalfont for some time when I was younger, and feeling for Mr. Geiger and his woes, tried to strike up a conversation. "So, you're from Chalfont? I used to go to school there." Mr. Geiger's head tilted upwards ever so slightly. His right hand shot up to his scarf-covered throat quickly, and with none of the trouble he had displayed before. He spoke slowly and with tremendous difficulty. "Yes, long way from home." I grimaced and turned away to hide the face, pretending to search for his room key. There was something in the way he spoke. It reminded me of the sound made by smokers who had a hole in their throat and had to cover it with their finger when talking. Worse still, it sounded like something was plucking his vocal cords like guitar strings. I refrained from asking any more questions, and passed the key to Mr. Geiger. He stood up, and in doing so accidentally bumped the power strip, causing the lights to go out. I instinctively dropped down to fix the strip, and froze before I stood. In the split second before the light had come on, I had caught Mr. Geiger looking at me from under his hat. He had begun to draw on the counter. More than that, in the dark something about his eyes had deeply disturbed me. Before I could even rise and tell him where the room was, he turned and shambled out of the door, his back bulging and shifting as he walked. I shook from disgust when I figured him far enough away, and crashed into my chair. It would be 2 more hours before I received the noise complaint. It was almost 3 a.m. when the phone rang. As I previously stated, the phone never rings because we never sell out. And even when we do, there's never anything louder than the creaking trees. It was hard to believe that either of the 2 guests I had were partying. But when I answered the phone, it was indeed Tim in room 8. Tim explained that there was a horrendous pounding and scratching on his ceiling, as if something was tapping maddeningly at the roof. I assured him that it was the trees at the back of the property, and that none of our rooms could escape their reach. If he needed it, I had earplugs in the office I could run over. Tim thanked me and hung up the phone. I grabbed the individual package of earplugs just in case. Sure enough, in less than 5 minutes Tim had called back to say that the banging and scraping had increased in speed, and if it would be too much of a bother for me to check to make sure there was no bird or raccoon on the roof above his room. I assured him that I would do just that, and grabbed the high-powered flashlight from under the desk, and hung up the phone. Outside the air hung thick like a cloud. No fog had rolled in, but I suspected it would soon. There was no breeze, and I started to sweat halfway across the lot. I flipped on the high-powered beam and shone it on the rooftop, panning from the far left to the right. At first I was confused. None of the trees were moving at all. In fact, everything was eerily still. I continued the sweep and froze above room 8. The trees began moving in a flurry, the cracking creaking of branches being pushed out of the way, thundering through the silence. Some animal had indeed gotten on the roof, and spooked by the light, scampered off the side of the building above room 10. I flipped off the light, happy that I had scared whichever pest had gotten onto the roof. I walked the rest of the way to the dimly lit rooms, and knocked gently on room 8. There was a minute before I could hear Tim's muted steps walk towards the door. He was in his nightclothes and seemed rather peeved. But when I told him I'd scared whatever it was off the building, he smiled and nodded. He passed me a $5 for a tip, and I passed him the earplugs I'd bought from the office. I told him to put those in just in case whatever was on the roof decided to come back. It was not uncommon for raccoons or squirrels to take trash and nuts up there, and then try to open them up against the rooftop. Tim thanked me again and shut the door. Before returning to the office, I had considered checking in with Mr. Geiger to be sure that the noise had not disturbed him, but figured it better to call the phone next to his bed rather than make him walk across the room to the door. I entered the office and grabbed the phone over the counter. I dialed for room 10 and waited. There was no answer, and after 5 or 6 rings I hung up the phone. Whatever had fled the roof had not disturbed Mr. Geiger's rest, and it was better to leave him be. I returned to my chair behind the desk and pulled out a sandwich from my lunchbox, happy to return to the peace and quiet my job provided. Normally, when working the night shift, you should do a sweep of the lot at 12 AM, 4 AM, and then one last time before clocking out at 8. Because I had answered Tim's request to check the roof, I'd already swept the parking lot once. But when the wall clock clicked 4 AM, I was already beginning my sweep. I walked from the front door of the office to the road, sweeping my flashlight in front of me as I walked. Once or twice I could hear the branches of the great trees behind me creak and sway, and it unsettled me since seeing whatever it was dart across the roof. I'd seen a couple different critters move across the treetops before, but nothing at that speed, and whatever it was, it had to be at least the size of a Labrador. But stranger things had happened, and there were bears in the woods, so I shook it off. When I turned around and started walking back towards the tenant rooms, something stopped me. It was not the silence or the trees. It was something about the lot. Tim had his car parked near his room, but that was the only one. Had Mr. Geiger walked here? Oh, more than likely he was dropped off. I couldn't imagine with his side and gait that he could operate a vehicle. As I swept the light across the lot, I began to smell something foul. Probably the carcass of some poor animal that had been caught as prey earlier. Maybe that was what had been on the roof. A fox carrying its snack. Then I noticed Mr. Geiger's door was open. The smell, it seemed, was coming from near his room. It was possible that whatever had afflicted Mr. Geiger was making the smell, remembering the visits to the hospital to see my grandfather. Or maybe whatever had fled the roof had dropped its prey behind his room. I resolved to go check it out, hoping to avoid another call by either of my guests about the smell. I walked wide right of Mr. Geiger's room and shone my flashlight towards the back of the building. This area was not well maintained by the landscaping crew, and seemed to be overgrown with moss and rocks as ancient as the trees. The rocks were sometimes stacked in strange rows or piles, and I imagined that some drifters had used them as tables. Those rocks had always bothered me, but that wasn't what bothered me now. There was no smell here. The smell had disappeared around the back of the building, and that meant whatever was the source was either around front or in a room. I turned around and slowly walked towards the edge of the building where Mr. Geiger's room was located. The smell was definitely coming from 10. I made the mistake of inhaling through my nose and immediately gagged, coughing up a bout of phlegm. I covered my nose with my shirt and inched closer. The door was still cracked, the light within illuminating the door like some dark portal. I knocked softly and called out, "Mr. Geiger, this is the front desk. Is everything okay?" I waited for a few seconds, but there was no answer. Perhaps this was a medical issue that I was intruding on, and Mr. Geiger had opened the door to air out his room. Could he be hurt? I knocked louder and leaned my ear towards the door. The only sound was the TV within, hissing out some children singing the Itsy Bitsy Spider song on some late night cartoon. I backed away from the door and paused. If Mr. Geiger was in trouble, I'd have to go inside. The phone in the office took too long to call out from, and my cell phone was still charging and would need time to boot up. I knocked again and announced my entrance. I wish I had ran instead. I gently pushed open the door and glanced around the room. All at once I had taken in the room, and all at once I wish I had never moved back here, never worked at this hotel. Above me, the trees began to creak and crack. Inside the room, the bed remained untouched, but the light on the side table had been turned on. Mr. Geiger's coat was discarded on a chair in the corner. The TV continued to hiss out that children's song. There, in front of the TV, was Mr. Geiger. He had collapsed face forward, his hat tumbling to the front door now near my feet. But what was most horrifying was that Mr. Geiger's hump had exploded outwards. His ribs shone in the TV's lights, poking out through flesh and muscle. The back of Mr. Geiger's head was also blown outwards, and I could see tiny puffs of the shag carpet poking through his now empty sockets. I staggered backwards, a scream trying to fight its way out of my throat, but no sound came. I turned and ran. I ran as fast as I could, sprinting towards the front office. I didn't look back. I remember hearing a loud banging on the roof of the hotel, fast and rapid. The animal had returned, but it was the least of my worries. I'd need to call 911 as fast as possible. I threw open the office door and nearly vaulted over the counter, grasping at my cell phone. As it slowly came to life, I frantically punched in the code to call out from the office phone. Before I could reach the end, however, from across the lot came a loud crashing and a blood-curdling scream. Tim had found the body. With my cell phone nearly ready, I ran outside again, hoping to find and calm Tim. I was not halfway across the parking lot before I stopped and froze. Tim's door was open, and he was standing in the doorway. I waved to him, and at first he did not wave back. Then slowly, his arm raised and wagged back and forth. I took a step back. Fumbling, he took a step forward. Something was very wrong. My brain screamed at me to turn and flee. I couldn't understand why. Was he drunk? He was definitely walking like it. Had he not been so friendly before? There was nothing off about his attire, except it seemed to be riding slightly high, so that his stomach was not out showing, as if he had a backpack on under the shirt. Was it the way his head was lolling to one side now? Or maybe it was the way he had stepped forward, the same way I had seen Mr. Geiger walk earlier. I took another step back. Before I could turn and run, the form of Tim scuttled towards me. I say scuttled because Tim's feet were no longer touching the ground. Instead, 4 massive spider-like legs were moving him forward, visible now that they had moved out of the darkness of his room. His bowed head slammed backwards from the sudden acceleration, and from his gaping mouth came a long, high-pitched scream I have never heard before, and never wish to hear again. His arms and legs wagged lazily behind him, as if he were an outfit airing out to dry in the wind. The screaming came now. I screamed as loud as I could as I fled toward the street. My only hope was a passing car that I could jump into to flee this nightmare. I ran into the road and turned left. I heard the car roaring towards me before I saw it. It was the same engine I had heard earlier. It was the high school punk making his rounds again. And if I didn't get out of the way, I'd be flattened. I turned to jump and was lucky to just miss being slaughtered. I thank God every day that whatever that was behind me was not so quick to dodge. Going what looked like 100 miles per hour, the car crashed into the nightmare. In those brief moments, time seemed to slow, and I would gouge out my eyes if my mind would erase what those headlights had shown. It was like a massive spider, bigger than any human, and it was wearing Tim like a mask. The front 4 legs of it were stuffed into Tim's form, working his arms and legs clumsily. Its head was probably in Tim's face, and I shuddered to think whatever it used to pluck at Mr. Geiger's vocal cords. The car smashed into it and it flew into the darkness. Unfortunately, the kid was not wearing his seatbelt and was jettisoned through his windshield. I turned and fled. I didn't care who was alive or dead, only that I had the strength to run as far away as I could. The ancient trees on either side of me cracked and swayed as I ran. I ran, and I screamed. I have no memory of being found, but the police told me they picked me up nearly 5 miles away, with the bottoms of my shoes worn out. My feet had blistered and were sticky with blood. I had a 1,000-yard stare in my eyes, and only gave any kind of response when asked if I could go back to the hotel with them. I responded violently, kicking, screaming and spitting. I refused, but I was handcuffed and taken back. I remember arriving. I had shut my eyes as tight as possible. The morning sun was just peeking out over the trees. I dared not look at the thing the car had hit in the light. It was bad enough to want to rip my brain out for seeing it in the headlights. I only opened my eyes when the police told me they had the situation under control. According to them, Tim had wandered into the street and was struck by the high school kid. The collision had obliterated Tim's body into a nearly unrecognizable mess. Mr. Geiger's body was still in the room, but medical analysis has yet to discover what caused his body to explode. And in their opinion, I would learn later, it was built-up gases. His hat and jacket had disappeared as well. It wouldn't bother me that they would call me crazy behind my back when I told them the story, or that they would call me mad when I whispered of the creature, and refer me to doctors that said I had imagined it all to cope with the trauma of seeing Tim hit by that car. No. What made me move was what I heard the police say. They let me out of the car in cuffs, and I slowly scanned the lot. I'd be called crazy without a doubt. Tim's body had been flung some ways towards my office. There was no creature. There was only the car and Tim. You could see in the road where the kid had slammed on the brakes. You could see the streaks of blood and meat where his body had flown through the windshield. The cop must have noticed me staring. There was no kid in the street. Had he gotten up and stumbled away? The cop put a reassuring hand on my shoulder. Don't worry. We just got a call that someone matching his description stumbled into a hotel down the road. He was wearing a trench coat and hat, probably banged up and scared. We're gonna go get him some help. I will never go back. Well, I'm done rambling for now, listener. Wasn't that fun? I hope our writers survive their encounters, so they can tell me more of their tales, and I can ramble through them with you. Good night, listener, and do take care, because you never know what's out there.